Welcome to the Make It Make Sense podcast, where we do deep dives into everything interesting.
All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into Canadian politics.
Okay, sounds good.
Specifically, we're going to try to figure out if Justin Trudeau's time as prime minister is coming to an end.
Interesting.
I mean, remember when he was considered like this global icon? He was in Vogue, Rolling Stone. Now, public opinion seems to have taken a pretty sharp turn. The BBC article says his approval rating has plummeted from 63% in 2015 to only 28% this past June.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
That's massive. So what happened?
Well, it's really interesting how much economic anxieties can impact how the public views its leaders, especially a leader who, rode in on this wave of hope and change. When people are struggling to afford housing, groceries, basic necessities, they really start to question the leadership.
Right. It's like that old saying, it's the economy, stupid.
That's exactly. People might be drawn to charisma and big promises, but when times get tough, those things can only get you so far.
For sure.
And that's, I think, what we're seeing here. All three of these articles point to this disconnect that people are feeling between Trudeau's initial promises when he was first elected and the economic realities that a lot of Canadians are facing today.
Yeah, it's like this 1-2 punch. First, everyone goes through the pandemic, which was incredibly difficult. And just as it seems like things are getting back to normal, the economy throws this curveball.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the pandemic, that seems like that was kind of a turning point for Trudeau's popularity as well.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
I mean, at first, his pandemic response, especially those early release packages, actually boosted his approval. People appreciated the quick action and, that sense of we're all in this together.
You're right.
But as the pandemic dragged on and the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates came into play, that's when things really started to shift.
Yeah, those vaccine mandates were really divisive. I feel like that's when we really saw this, angry man alternative Pierre Poilievre start to emerge.
Yeah, you're right. Pierre Poilievre, Trudeau's main rival from the Conservative Party, he was able to tap into a lot of the discontent and the frustration that was bubbling under the surface about, all of these things, the pandemic, the economy.
Yeah.
He positioned himself as this champion for the people who felt like their concerns weren't being heard by the Trudeau government.
It's like we're watching a political drama unfold in real time.
Right.
The once popular leader facing all these challenges and this charismatic rival waiting in the wings to capitalize on any misstep. So before we get into the Pierre Poilievre situation, I think we need to rewind a little bit and make sure everyone listening understands who we're talking about. The Politico article mentions this term populism a lot when they're talking about Poilievre. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Yeah, so populism in its simplest terms is basically a way of appealing to people who feel like the elites. And that could be the government, the media, academics. They feel like the elites aren't listening to them.
Okay.
So populist leaders, they kind of position themselves as the voice of the people, voice of the ordinary person, against a system that they say is broken or rigged against them.
So is Poilievre saying that Trudeau and the Liberals aren't listening to the average Canadian?
Yeah, essentially. The Politico article gave this great example. They said that Poilievre uses this phrase, Canada is broken, a lot in his speeches. And that really seems to resonate with people who are struggling, who feel like the system isn't working for them.
So they're looking for someone to blame.
Right. And Poilievre is giving them an enemy.
So tell me more about this freedom convoy thing that the Politico article mentioned. Was that Poilievre's doing?
Well, not directly.
Yeah.
The Freedom Convoy protests were these huge protests in Ottawa that started in early 2022. Initially, they were about the vaccine mandates for truckers crossing the U.S.-Canada border.
Okay.
But it quickly became about way more than that. It became this lightning rod for all kinds of frustrations with the Trudeau government,
Wow.
COVID-19 restrictions, the economy. And Poilievre, he saw an opportunity and he seized it.
So while Trudeau is trying to navigate this incredibly complex situation, Poilievre is busy winning over voters who feel like their frustrations are being ignored.
Exactly. He didn't create the Freedom Convoy, but he very much capitalized on it. He positioned himself as an ally to the protesters and tapped into that wave of anger and distrust that was driving the movement.
Interesting. So you've got Trudeau, who's always been very careful to cultivate this image of, the progressive global leader.
Right.
But then you have Poilievre, who's using that image against him.
Yeah. And the Politico article mentions these conservative campaign ads that really highlight this contrast.
Like what? Give me the details.
Okay, so picture this. You see Trudeau in these glossy magazine spreads, right? Attending international summits, giving speeches at the UN. He looks every bit the global elite.
Okay.
And then the ad cuts to Poilievre. He's wearing jeans and a T-shirt. He's having a barbecue with his family. It's this very deliberate contrast meant to make Trudeau seem out of touch with ordinary Canadians.
And this is working.
Well, the polls suggest it's resonating with some voters for sure. And this is especially potent when you consider the fact that Trudeau and his wife recently separated.
Right.
So you have Poilievre, who's presenting this image of himself as this dedicated family man. And it plays into this narrative that Trudeau's priorities are no longer aligned with those of average Canadians.
So it's not just about policies anymore. It's about image. It's about who voters can relate to on like a personal level.
Exactly. And unfortunately for Trudeau, there have been a few scandals, if you will, that have provided his opponents with even more ammunition to make this argument that he's lost touch.
Like what are we talking about here?
Well, the big one that keeps coming up is the SNC-Lavalin affair.
Okay, can we pause there for a second because I think we need to give our listeners some context. The SNC-Lavalin thing was a big deal in Canadian politics, but not everyone might be familiar with it.
Of course.
So can you give us the Spark Notes version?
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, the SNC-Lavalin affair was this political scandal that blew up in 2019. It involved allegations that Trudeau and his office had pressured the then Attorney General to draw up criminal charges against this big engineering firm called SNC-Lavalin. And this SNC-Lavalin, they were facing all these charges of bribery and corruption related to their dealings in Libya.
Okay, so this was a pretty big deal.
Oh, yeah, it was huge.
Yeah.
This whole thing raised all these questions about political interference in the justice system, whether Trudeau was trying to protect a powerful corporation, and it really damaged his reputation.
So even though it happened a few years ago, it seems like it's still following him around.
Oh, absolutely. It was a major blow to his image, and it really planted those seeds of doubt in the minds of a lot of Canadians about his judgment, his integrity.
Interesting. So what else contributed to this kind of decline in Trudeau's standing?
Well, the 2021 election didn't really go the way that Trudeau had hoped.
Yeah.
I mean, he called this snap election 2 years early, thinking that he could capitalize on, his pandemic popularity and win a majority government.
Right.
But as the Politico article points out, he miscalculated on a few key issues, like his handling of this controversial language law in Quebec. And it ended up backfiring. He ended up right back in a minority government situation, which really just highlighted his vulnerability.
And then on top of all of that, you have this global instability,
Yeah.
which always seems to make things more complicated for whoever's in charge.
For sure. And the Israel-Hamas war, which obviously erupted earlier this year, really just threw another wrench into things.
Yeah, how did that impact his standing?
Well, the Politico article said that he's facing criticism from both sides on this one. Some people think he hasn't done enough to support Israel, while others criticize him for not being vocal enough in condemning the violence against Palestinians.
Right, it's like the classic political dilemma. If you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in this case, it just seems to be adding to this overall sense that Trudeau is losing his grip on the narrative.
It's like he's trying to steer a ship through a hurricane. But that actually might be a perfect place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the economic anxieties, the rise of Pierre Poilievre, and all these different scandals and missteps that seem to be dragging Trudeau down in the polls. But we're only halfway through our deep dive. We still need to unpack what this all means for Trudeau's future and for the future of Canada.
Yeah, and it's not just about Trudeau, right?
Right.
It feels like Canada as a whole is kind of at this crossroads.
Totally. And the Canada's National Observer article actually had this really interesting point. They said that 1 in 5 Canadians want Trudeau gone just because they're, quote, tired of him.
Wow.
Tired of him.
Yeah, 9 years is a long time to be prime minister.
It's true.
And those haven't exactly been quiet years,
Not at all.
So it's understandable that there might be some fatigue setting in.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. We've had the pandemic, the economic downturn, all these political scandals and controversies.
Right.
It's a lot for anyone to handle, let alone the leader of a country.
Exactly. And this is where I think someone like Poilievre becomes really dangerous for Trudeau.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, because Poilievre is tapping into that fatigue, that frustration with the status quo. He's offering something different, something new. And for voters who are just tired of the same old thing, that can be really appealing.
Right. It's like that old saying, a change is as good as a rest.
Exactly. People might not even know exactly what they want, but they know they want something to change.
And Poilievre is offering them that change.
He is. And he's doing it by framing the debate on his own terms.
Okay, so how is he doing that?
Well, for one thing, he's really good at using language to connect with people's emotions. Like the Politico article mentioned how he uses the word freedom constantly. Freedom from government, overreach, freedom from economic hardship, freedom to make your own choices. It's a very powerful message, especially in times like these when people are feeling uncertain and anxious about the future.
Right. It's like he's giving them a reason to be hopeful.
Exactly. He's saying, hey, I hear your frustrations, I see your struggles, and I'm here to fight for you. And that message, it really resonates with a certain segment of the population.
So what can Trudeau do at this point? Can he come back from this, or is it too late?
Well, the Politico article actually talked about that. They said that even some people within the Liberal Party are starting to lose faith in Trudeau.
That's not good.
No, it's not. And they pointed to this recent cabinet shuffle as a sign that even Trudeau knows he needs to shake things up.
Okay, so remind me, what was the cabinet shuffle all about again?
So basically, Trudeau switched up some of the ministers in his cabinet, moved some people around,
Yeah.
gave some different people different roles.
Okay.
It's kind of a classic political move when a leader is trying to freshen things up, seem more in touch with the public.
And did it work?
Well, according to the experts, not really. I mean, it made some headlines for a few days, but
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to have moved the needle much in the polls.
It seems like every time Trudeau takes one step forward,
Right.
something happens and he ends up right back where he started.
It's true. And, elections are strange things. You never really know what's going to happen until the votes are counted.
So there's still a chance Trudeau could pull off another victory.
It's not impossible,
Yeah.
but he's definitely facing an uphill battle. He needs to find a way to reconnect with voters, to convince them that he understands their concerns, and that he has a plan to address them.
It's interesting, though, because this whole situation with Trudeau, it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening in a lot of other countries, right?
What do you mean?
Well, it feels like we're seeing this global trend of people becoming disillusioned with traditional politicians and political parties.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're looking for alternatives. They're looking for leaders who are willing to shake things up to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And that's what makes someone like Poilievre so interesting,
Yeah.
because he's part of this larger global movement of populism.
And how would you define populism?
Well, in a nutshell, it's a political approach that appeals to the common person. It often pits the people against the elites, those in power. And it thrives on this idea that the system is rigged against the ordinary person.
So you're saying that Poilievre is tapping into this sense of frustration that a lot of people are feeling right now?
Precisely. He's giving voice to those who feel like their concerns are being ignored by the establishment. And whether you agree with his policies or not, you can't deny that he's struck a nerve.
This is all so fascinating, but it seems like there's one crucial piece of this puzzle that we haven't fully explored yet.
And what's that?
The issue of Indigenous reconciliation. The Politico article mentioned that the SNC-Lavalin affair damaged Trudeau's standing on this issue, but it didn't really go into detail.
That's a really important point, because Indigenous reconciliation has been one of Trudeau's signature issues throughout his entire time in office.
It was a big part of his platform back in 2015.
Exactly. He came into office promising to make it a top priority. And to be fair, he has taken some steps in the right direction. Well, for example, he's increased funding for Indigenous communities. He's launched an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And he's committed to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Those sound like positive steps.
They are. But the problem is that progress has been slow. And there's a real disconnect between the promises that Trudeau has made and the reality on the ground for many Indigenous people.
Can you give me some specific examples of that disconnect?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest ones is the lack of clean drinking water in many Indigenous communities. I mean, this is a basic human right, and yet there are still so many communities that don't have access to it.
Wow, that's really disheartening to hear.
It is. And then there's the issue of the child welfare system. Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented in care, and there have been calls for a complete overhaul of the system for years, but not much has changed.
It sounds like Trudeau's relationship with Indigenous communities is complicated.
It's very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that he's going to have to address head on if he wants to win re-election.
Right, because even if he can convince the rest of Canada that he deserves another term,
Right.
he needs to make sure that he hasn't lost the support of Indigenous voters.
Exactly. Because they could be the ones who decide the election.
It's like this whole situation with Trudeau and Indigenous reconciliation is a microcosm of his entire time in office.
What do you mean?
Well, it's a story of big promises and high hopes, followed by disappointment and a sense of unfulfilled potential.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder, even if Trudeau does manage to pull off another election victory, what will his legacy be?
Right. Will he be remembered as the prime minister who promised so much but ultimately failed to deliver?
Or will he be seen as someone who at least tried to tackle some of Canada's most pressing issues, even if he wasn't always successful?
These are the big questions that historians will be debating for years to come.
Exactly. But for now, I think it's safe to say that Trudeau's legacy is still very much unwritten.
And that's actually a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Because we've spent all this time talking about the past and the present, but what about the future? Where does Canada go from here?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is, and it's a question that we're going to try to answer in part 3 of our deep dive. It really feels like we've gone from this high-level analysis of Canadian politics to something much more kind of human and emotional.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
we're talking about the soul of a nation trying to figure out its place in the world.
It's true.
Yeah.
And one thing that really comes through in all three of these articles is this underlying sense of anxiety about the future. You know?
Yeah, like this feeling of where do we go from here?
Exactly. And it's not just about the economy or politics, it's about identity, too.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about the Canada's National Observer article. They talked about this growing divide between Canadians who feel like they're being left behind by globalization, by technology, and those who are thriving in this new world order.
Right, and it's like those anxieties, those fears, they create this fertile ground for someone like Polyev to come in and say, hey, I hear you, I see you, the system is rigged against you, and I'm the only one who can fix it.
Exactly. And that kind of message, it can be really appealing to people who are feeling lost and forgotten.
Especially when the alternative is someone like Trudeau, who's seen as part of the establishment.
Right, exactly.
And it's interesting, though, because the BBC article made this point about how Trudeau's brand of progressive politics, it doesn't seem to be resonating with younger voters the way it used to.
That's a really important point because for a long time, Trudeau was seen as this kind of political rock star, especially among young people.
Right, like he was the cool prime minister.
Exactly. But now it seems like even young people are starting to question whether he's really the one to lead Canada into the future.
So what does all of this mean for the future of Canadian politics? Is this the end of Trudeau-mania, or can he somehow reinvent himself before the next election?
Well, if we had to make a prediction based on these articles, I'd say it's going to be really tough for him to turn things around.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he's facing an uphill battle for sure. But then again, you never know with elections.
True, stranger things have happened.
Exactly. But I think the bigger question is, even if Trudeau does manage to hold on to power for another term, what will that mean for Canada?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too, because it feels like something fundamental has shifted in Canadian society.
I agree. And I think these articles have done a really good job of capturing that shift.
They really have.
Mm-hmm.
We've gone from talking about Trudeau's approval rating to having this really deep conversation about the soul of Canada.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It really has been. So I guess the only question left to ask is what happens next?
I don't know, but I can't wait to find out.
Me neither.
Uh,
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure exploring these articles with you.
the pleasure was all mine.
And a huge thank you to our listeners for submitting these fascinating pieces. We couldn't do it without you. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and stay curious.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Make It Make Sense podcast. As always, if you learned anything from this episode, please take a moment to like this video, or if you found it intriguing and want to hear more, consider subscribing.